Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome to PCB webinar about ISO 27001 versus CCPA and the New York Shield Act. Today we'll be talking through these three different security/data privacy laws and standards. And we'll be looking at similarities and differences between them. We have myself and two other great presenters to talk to this topic. My experience is in information security, cybersecurity, privacy, and IT. And I've been working in those fields for a few decades now and enjoying it very much. And we also have Victoria McIntosh and Derek Stevenson. Victoria, could you introduce yourself, please?
Sure thing. All right. So hi, I'm Victoria McIntosh. I'm in the Atlantic Canada, Maritimes. My background's actually not security. It's actually information management and information science. I got in through a strong interest in privacy and became certified as an information privacy technologist. And of course, once you get into privacy, you quickly have to realize you have to learn security, or you're going to have you're going to run into some problems. So it's been a very interesting ride, but very fascinating too. So quite happy to be here.
Thanks, Victoria. Derek.
Hi, I'm Derek Stevenson. I'm the information security leader for a SaaS platform in Boston area. I've been involved in IT, information, cybersecurity, and privacy for the little over 2 decades now. And much like Tony, I've enjoyed the transitions over the years, and just always increasing, education and everything within this field. It's a wonderful field to be in.
Thanks, Derek. Great to have you both on board. So we're going to start today with a little overview on the current state of data security and privacy. Then we'll look at some current trends driving adoption of these increased laws and protections around data and privacy. And we'll look specifically at the examples of IEC 27001, CCPA, the California Protection Act for Data Privacy, and the New York Shield Act. Excuse me. And then we'll have a roundtable as well. We'll have an open discussion between the three of us and talk about some lessons to be applied from looking at these three different but still similar pieces of security guidance for data privacy and data security. So current state, we're going to be talking through some terminologies here related to data privacy and data protection. So we get a couple of terms here defined on this page: personally identifiable information, or PII, and personal health information, or PHI. These are both becoming a focus of concern for governments, organizations, and individuals around the globe, of course. It isn't just identity theft or those common types of hacking attacks that are driving these concerns. It's also the increase in attacks on establishments and organizations, including hospitals, governments, businesses that have data. And the target is typically the data, not necessarily the business organization itself. Ransomware and data breaches are also making headlines globally on a recurring and frequent basis, and we've all seen this. Ransomware is targeted to lock down your data and keep you from getting to it until you pay a ransom. And a data breach is exfiltration of your data to online sources for resale or reuse. Some evolutions that are underway that we've all heard about, I think, in the news lately. We've talked about this in previous PECB webinars as well. Blockchain as a technology is driving data authenticity, integrity, and protection initiatives. There's protective measures for cloud-hosted data. that are being evolved, and often those are coming from the vendors themselves, but there are third parties also making third-party products to shim on top of your cloud-based data to protect it better or provide some third-party sort of oversight on the protection of that data. There's fake news and deep fake issues going on right now. We've all heard a lot about fake news from elections like those in the United States, but deep fakes are also becoming far more sophisticated, with even recent examples coming out of Israel of deep fakes being used to mimic voices on telephones. So you think you're talking to someone specific, you may even know when you're not, you're talking to an AI-generated deep fake voice. Artificial intelligence, which links into those ideas of deep fakes, is also being used as a weapon and a defensive measure to protect or attack data reserves or to try to exfiltrate data. So we have three quick examples, or not necessarily quick, but three examples we're going to go through with you to talk about what this guidance for protecting data looks like today. And our first one is, of course, the well-known standard ISO 27001. And this is an international standard used around the globe. It's meant to give you an ISMS at the end of the day, an information security management system, from which you can generate processes, procedures, initiatives, measures within your organization to secure information, to secure infrastructure, to secure processes and procedures, and then a way to measure that and keep improving it over time. This is focused on information security, not specifically data privacy or data protection only. There have been some evolutions on that we'll talk about in a moment, though. It's not a mandatory or a legislated sort of standard that you have to be compliant with. It's optional. You can choose to become compliant with it. You can choose to become certified to it, even better, wherein you're going to be audited by a third-party audit firm that will measure your compliance and make sure you stay compliant to the principles that you've said you're going to be compliant to from the standard. An individual can be certified against 27001 and can become certified as an implementer, an auditor. They can take that certification and utilize that to audit other organizations or to show they have the skills and experience necessary to properly implement the standard. An organization can be certified so that they can show another organization, maybe a customer, client, that they have met minimum specifications, minimum standards for security within their organizations, and that they're being held accountable to that by a third-party independent audit process. The nice thing in this last bullet point, or next to last bullet point on this slide, the nice thing about ISO 27001 is that it's often used as a baseline for other standards, frameworks, and even legislation. With that in mind, if you can fully and completely understand 27001 and apply it properly, you're well equipped to take on other legislations, other standards related to security, and other guidance or frameworks you might want to apply that relate to security. Some examples are things like NIST SP 853, which has the principles of 27001 knitted throughout that entire framework. Within 27001 itself as a standard, there's a specific section, A1814, that talks about privacy and protection of personally identifiable information. And I put the quote from the standard here that talks about privacy and protection of PII shall be ensured as required in relevant legislation or regulation where applicable. Now, this is something that's important in 27001. You have to make sure that you've figured out what standards or what legislations you're supposed to be compliant with within your organization. And then you ensure that you're compliant with that legislation or with that standard as part of being compliant to 27001. There's an entire section that talks about compliance within this standard as well. And I've taken section A18 here and just outlined it on this slide. So these are the controls from the section. You see right at the top in the very first control element, they talk about identification and applicable legislation and contractual requirements. So in addition to understanding what legislation you should be compliant with as an organization, for example, if you were in California, you'd be compliant with most likely with the CCPA and other privacy and data protection relevant legislations within that state. And probably, depending on your business, some other national or maybe other state laws or legislations as well. Intellectual property rights have to be protected. Now, intellectual property rights, that's not PII, obviously, but it's something that an individual or an organization owns. So it's theirs, not yours. So you have to protect the intellectual property rights of other individuals, other organizations. And that's read another way within 27001 as well. You protect your own intellectual property as well from inappropriate dissemination or exfiltration. Protection of records. So there's the key points in this control that relate to protecting data. You protect from loss, destruction, falsification, unauthorized access, and release in accordance with those laws and regulations and so on, contractual requirements that you've agreed to as an organization or that you've said you have to be compliant with. Privacy protection, there's the PII statement at 1814. And then the last one is the regulation of cryptographic controls, which sounds like it has nothing at all to do with the rest of this section. But cryptographic controls are included in this section on compliance because sometimes you've agreed to certain levels of cryptographic protections within a contract with a third party, or perhaps you're required to have certain levels of encryption or cryptographic controls around data, around storage or handling of data, in compliance with a regulation or some kind of law or standard. So for 27001, compliance, as I said, is voluntary unless you're required to be compliant in specific instances. For example, from my lottery and gaming background, there are requirements to be compliant with 27001 in order to operate within certain jurisdictions. There's also the opportunity to certify an organization against this standard, and this would be done through a certified and authorized certification audit entity. The thing to be careful of here that I've seen happen a few times in my work in the security field is I've seen an organization claim to be certified to 27001 when in fact they don't have an actual verified auditor and verified certification entity giving them that certificate. It's just something someone gave them. So it's not really a certification against the standard. It's usually a compliance statement that someone's put in the form of a certificate. So make sure, of course, if you're going to get certified against the standard as an organization, you've chosen a certified, verified path to get your certification. So you're choosing a certified auditor representative of a certified audit entity that's part of a certification body that is authorized and recognized by ISO to provide that certification to you. Some gotchas for this standard. Although only one section specifically mentions PII, personally identifiable information, and the need to protect it, the remainder of the standard includes some other critical controls you have to be aware of and apply for protecting data in its various states. And by states, I don't mean locations within a country, I mean its statuses. So if it's at rest, if it's in transit, if it's being processed, the 3 states of data. Protecting that data, for example, within development, there's a development section within 27001 that talks about securing, for example, test data. If you're taking production data and moving it into a test environment to utilize it, you have to protect that. You have to obfuscate it, remove any sensitive information from it, make sure that data isn't reusable as live data within the test environment. So there's different guidance like that within 27001 sprinkled around it and through it that you have to be aware of in order to apply 27001 correctly to protect data. The next one is a good one to note if you're not aware of this one, 27701. And it's really an addition, in my mind, it feels like an addition to 27001. This one, though, is specifically aimed and targeted at privacy controls. It's often interpreted as being the privacy control set for cloud, for data in the cloud, but it can be applied in any instance when you read that control set. A lot of it is very useful for day-to-day privacy compliance. So this is a great add-on to 27001. And you can actually get audited and certified as an organization against 27001 and 27701 simultaneously. And I'd highly recommend that in today's environment, that you take both rather than just 27001, so that you at least have some privacy checks and some privacy controls in place. And then last one, I often see people mixing 27002 with 27001, but 27002 is sort of like a best practice guidance to implement 27001. You can't be certified against 27002. You're certified against 27001. So your certificate won't say you have a certification in 27002 if you're getting certified as an organization. It will say 27001. However, your auditor may use 27002 as a guidance to certify you against 27001 because it has specific information in there about how to implement controls, but it is not the standard you're certified against. There's often a lot of confusion around that, so I want to bring that up today too. So we'll talk now about the California Consumer Protection Act, or CCPA, and this will be over to Victoria.
All right, let's move. California Consumer Protection Act. And actually, I have a little bit of news on this one, but I'll wait till the gotcha section. So this is a privacy legislation. It was inspired by the General Data Protection Regulation in the European Union. I do want to point out, however, that it is not the GDPR. If you are GDPR compliant, that does not mean you are CCPA compliant. They are different legislations. Instead, think of the CCPA as, this brand new law happening in Europe. Residents in California saying, hey, Europeans, residents, they have all these new privacy rights. Why don't we? Why don't we have the same rights to our information, to our personal information? So it really is a legislation that emphasizes certain privacy rights for consumers. There are exclusions. It excludes employee data. So if you have staff in California, their employee data is excluded. It excludes publicly available information, which the legislation tends to refer to as, federal and state data banks. Very important to realize, publicly information does not include your face or like facial recognition situations. CCPA actually distinctly includes biometrics as part of the data that is protected. But it does exclude de-identified and aggregate information. So if you are able to take your information, for example, and get like population percentages where you can't identify an individual, that information is not subject to CCPA. Consumers may pursue civil action as a result of businesses' violation to implement and maintain reasonable security procedures and practices appropriate to the nature of the information. So for security, what the CCPA is saying, go on and do as you do, but if you have a data breach and when people are reviewing that, they find that you had inadequate data protections, they can sue you. So how do we implement the CCPA? Well, for starters, you should find out if your organization, if it applies to your organization. One of the interesting things about the CCPA is that its definition of business is really, you have to be a large business for this to apply. You have to either be making $25 million in revenue, or you're processing about 50,000 consumers of data or devices, or you make over 50% of your sales based on the sales of personal information. So this legislation really is intended to go after larger organizations, companies that are processing significant amount of data. If you're doing an event such as we're talking today, where you're only collecting a small amount of data, CCPA actually will not apply. What should you do? Well, for starters, if you don't have a privacy notice, and that's often that little privacy policy you'll see on your website, time to get one up. You want to improve it a little bit. You want to be very clear about the categories of personal information that's collected. You want to be clear about how that information is collected and the purpose of the information. Okay, what are you going to use it for? You should explain the user's rights under the California Consumer Privacy Act or have a separate page for California residents. So some privacy notices, again, if you have a large base in California, they may say, if you're a resident of California, click here, and here's a page illustrating, talk about your privacy rights. Or you may include it with the rest of your privacy notice. If selling personal information, you have to tell people, okay? And not only that, but you have to include an opt-out. People have the right to say, no, don't sell my information. You have to allow your users to contact you. If you have a web presence, for example, if you've got a Facebook profile, you need to set up a website. The legislation also recommends a toll-free number. So could people call you? Or do you have an address that they could write and mail? People need to be able to contact you and say, hey, what's going on here? Not legislated, but one of the things that very quickly when you're reading the CCPA is that it relies on recognizing categories of data. So I say in your best interest to know what information you have. This is things like data inventories. This is called, do you have a data classification plan? Anything that you have where you can identify, okay, this is the personal information our organization has, this is where it's stored, this is what we're going to use it for, this is how it's protected. All of those things in the CCPA makes it a lot easier to implement. Training, you can't have a staff, if somebody's calling about their privacy rights and a staff member says, oh, that's not my problem and hangs up, that's not good. At the very least, you should have all staff are being aware that you are going to comply, where or whom they can get in contact with if they have questions, if they want to enforce their privacy rights, hey, contact our privacy officer, or we have a form on our website, here's the address. Just gonna, compliance requirements, update your contracts, okay? Again, are you a business under the CCPA or are you a service provider, okay? Are you the best data analytics firm around and you're processing a lot of data for another company? In that case, your contract should specify that. Particularly service provider contracts need to, basically your third-party kind of controls in terms of, okay, you are processing data for us. Therefore, you are prohibited from retaining the information for yourselves, from using it, from disclosing it for any other purpose than for providing a service. Website updates, in addition to that privacy notice piece, if you're planning to sell information, include a section on do not sell my personal information that allows users to opt out of information sales. This should not be hidden. Don't make this, don't fall into dark patterns where this requires about 8 different clicks to find. The legislation clearly says it has to be very easy for users to access. Okay, something that's linked from the homepage, something that's linked from the privacy notice. Very quick, hey, I want to opt out of information sales, this is where I can go. As I emphasized before, CCPA is all about the user's rights. So it has, the users have the right to request businesses delete information. There are exemptions. Interestingly enough, security logs are a good one. Of course, if you've collected information to comply with another legislation, there's likely an exemption there. Users have the right to request when information is collected, processed, used, and when PI is shared and disclosed. Okay, so people have a right to know what's going on, what information do you have on me, and what's going to happen with it. Users have the right to request when PI is sold, the categories of the PI is sold, and the categories of to whom it was sold. So again, so getting it back into that classification section, you have to be able to say, oh, we sell your information to this type of firm. And we're selling, are you selling addresses? Are you selling demographics? Are you selling what type of information is part of that process? Users have the right for a business not to sell their information. Again, that right to opt out. And users have the right not to be discriminated against for exercising privacy rights. So you can't charge a fee for a user who is enforcing their privacy rights. You can't make a product, say one product for people who do not care about privacy and one product that has stricter privacy controls for a different price. It's same playing field, basically. You have to provide the exact same privacy, same product and service, regardless if the person is enforcing their privacy rights or not. Some gotchas. Well, first of all, always please verify requests for information. We see this a lot with privacy legislation, especially when they come out and people are first getting used to them. Is yes, the laws do say that individuals have a right to access their information, to know what information they've got. It is on you, and the CCPA law actually makes this very clear, to verify that the person on the other end of the email, the phone, the request is actually the right individual, that they are who they say they are. We're talking security here, and social engineers, they know this stuff. They know, hey, there's a law here that says I could call up a company and say I'm John Smith, and they're supposed to give me my personal information. So you do have to verify requests. And again, with staff training, teach staff to do this as well. Very little advice on data protection implementation, and this is actually kind of a little frustrating with CCPA. Because again, you have a law which says that civil action can be taken if you have inadequate data controls. But the law itself doesn't tell you what adequate data controls are. It actually has nowhere in the legislation does it say, oh, you need to have backups, you need to have, anti-malware, you need to patch. Instead, the best we can find is that it says, is data encrypted or unencrypted? And it tends to refer to unencrypted data as less secure. So this is not a legislation that offers good advice for security. I would definitely refer to ISO if you want to say how secure you are. There are exemptions to other laws. The big one, of course, is many are familiar with the HIPAA, the privacy legislation across the United States. If you are dealing with health technology, for example, you are a business associate who sells your technology to a hospital, to a clinic in the United States, and you are required to comply with HIPAA, HIPAA trumps CCPA. Okay, HIPAA has much stronger privacy controls, much stronger security controls. Always follow HIPAA when in doubt. There is a lot of confusion. One of the things that quickly becomes clear when you look into this legislation is that there's a lot of frustration over, okay, what qualifies as the sale of data? And again, the legislation makes references to categories of data, but it actually doesn't lay out what those categories are. It's up to you to define your own categories. So there's a little bit of frustration among privacy pros, even I guess among some larger companies when this law first came out in terms of, well, how are you expecting this to go? And we have a little update here. So California recently said, you know what, we want stronger legislation. And as of the November election, the new act, a new set of privacy rights has gone through and has been approved. So good news for those who were in a panic, this new privacy law will not go into force until 2023. It will affect information that is captured as of 2022. But yeah, just a heads up, we are going to see a new privacy legislation in California pretty soon. So, and with that in mind, I believe I will turn it over to talk about Privacy Shield.
Thank you very much, Victoria. It's hilarious that we're doing this presentation today, and they've just passed that new legislation in California, so that's good timing, I guess. Derek will now speak on the New York Shield Act.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. Victoria. Yeah, so the New York Shield Act, I believe just a precursor, the material that went out initially may have indicated NYC Shield Act. That was just a little oversight. It should just be the New York Shield Act. The city is covered under it. It's the whole state. So we can go on to the overview. So the overview, data protection, privacy, and the New York Shield Act. Abbreviation for Stop Hacks and Improve Electronic Data Security Act, Shield Act. It's a very nice acronym. So what is the Shield Act? It requires any business out there that is going to collect information for a New York State resident. So if you're collecting any form of information, kind of like CCPA or GDPR, you have to adhere to certain security requirements now regardless of where your business is located. If you have anything with a New York State resident, you will have to be compliant with the New York Shield Act. And this bill, it also broadened the scope of the information that is covered under there. So they have specific callouts now for your, fingerprints, bio information, everything like that. And also specific requirements around data breach, which we will get into a little bit more during the implementation. But the data breach one is definitely one that a business will need to take a little extra time on and review. We can go on to the implementation. So the implementing of New York Shield Act, it's rather loose in a way. They refer to, the reasonable administrative safeguards, the reasonable technical safeguards, and reasonable physical safeguards. So that is a little open to interpretation. They do give some, requirements in there. You'll have to designate specific people for your security program. You'll need to identify internal and external risks, assess how sufficient the safeguards are in place, how you're training your employees on the practices and procedures. The third-party risk, how you're selecting your providers and such. Technical, again, it's just reasonable how you're going to assess the risks for your network or your software, assessing the risks to how the information is processed, transmitted, or stored. Reasonable for detection, prevention, how you're going to regularly test. And then the physical safeguards, if you're, a traditional brick and mortar server room, how you're assessing the risks for where that information is stored and processed or disposed. And again, the detections, how you're going to access the server rooms and such. So they just lead to a lot of reasonable items. But you'll also notice that a lot of these kind of coincide with the ISO 27001 that Tony was mentioning. So it's not that you'll have to go to a full new information security management system to comply with the New York Shield Act. So yeah, the compliance requirements, again, it goes back to everything that is reasonable, security practices, policies, procedures, and safeguards. You'll have to go through and see, doing your risk assessments to see what kind of risks you have with that data and what is going to be what you feel is reasonable to protect that. You're not going to be able to just, accept all the risk because that won't necessarily be reasonable. So you'll definitely have to take time and do proper risk assessment procedures through those three areas. Now, the New York Shield Act does take into account different sizes of businesses. They had the foresight to realize if you're a smaller business, much to what Victoria indicated with CCPA, you won't have to implement every single thing. You'll just have to do a small subset of the various controls, but it still reflects back to being reasonable within every single one of those areas. And they do have provisions in there if you're already, certified or have to be compliant with HIPAA or high-tech Graham-Leachy Act or some of the other New York cybersecurity requirements. You're automatically going to be covered under the New York Shield Act. So that is a bonus that regard anyway. And we can go on to the next one, Tony. And gotchas. Similar to CCPA and GDPR, the Shield Act expands on the liability an organization has that's collecting private information for New York residents, regardless of where they are. So I think some businesses might just assume that, well, we don't have business in New York, we're good. Even if you have a news group and you have New York resident data within that, and you're, down in Australia, you would still need to be compliant with the New York Shield Act. So people really need to be aware of the geographic data, people that they are collecting data on. So the breach. This one is, I think, like I said, a very interesting one that people need to focus in on. New York data privacy law require that in the event of a breach, a business must notify any and all New York residents whose private information may have been compromised. Now, with this expanded definition, it's going to enhance what you do. So any type of data breach, as small as it may be, even if it was internal and data may not have been compromised to the outside, you would still actually need to release a breach notification. There are some exceptions in there that you can apply depending on the data subset that may have been inadvertently transmitted or released, but it's still something that needs to take significant time to understand what your breach requirements may be under this new act. And the private information, so they expanded on what that is, the account information, biometric data, the iris scans, fingerprints, voice prints, etc., that are used to identify someone's identity. And this also includes username or email with a combination of a password or even just the security questions or passcode. So I think a lot of times businesses, people might think, well, it's just a traditional username or I just have an email address. It doesn't really matter. But if the email address and even just the security questions get released, you would have to revert back to the data breach regulations that are within and validate if you need to do a breach notice. So I think a big focus for the gotchas is the data breach notification to really fully understand what you may have to release to New York on that.
Fantastic. Thanks very much, Derek. Very interesting stuff. And I must bring up again that on the 27001 front, there's nothing specific in there related to some of these privacy principles you've seen in both CCPA and New York Shield Act. Nothing like saying you have to make sure people agree to have their information shared or make sure they opt in to data collection. Those are reserved for more specific guidance from ISO, like 27701, which, as I mentioned earlier, is a great add-on for 27001. So, roundtable chat between the three of us just for a minute or two, just to compare what we just heard. Derek, you want to speak to that first point? CCPA, GDPR, New York Shield Act, similar, but with the evolution of the Shield Act, there's some expansion there.
Yeah, I think a lot of states are going to be going this way. I mean, GDPR covers a wide variety. So the states, California, New York, I believe Maine, Florida. There's so many states. I think there's like 22 that are developing their own privacy, security, compliance, and I think we're going to see a lot of them go to be, it doesn't matter where the business is being conducted. If you have that state residence data, you're going to have to be compliant in some form, some fashion to protect that data, regardless where your business is and if you have those people's information.
That's really expansive, but I guess we've seen a similar thing happening with GDPR anyway, so we've come to expect that, but now we'll just have to keep an eye on more of these standards, regulations, and practices at the state level, even in the US, because it could affect business elsewhere.
Yeah, it's going to be, I think, a challenging world over the next few years for privacy professionals, information security professionals, as they work to see what exactly each minute data information is different within those and how they're going to apply it to their organization. It's going to definitely take time and investment for a business.
In
It,
Victoria, sorry?
I was just going to say, it definitely drives home, I don't see it happening anytime soon, but how a federal legislation across the United States would be beneficial to be able to say, for example, again, HIPAA is the health legislation that doesn't matter what state you're in. So to see something, I wouldn't count on anytime soon, but again, to see something at a federal level say, these are the minimum privacy standards that you should be following, I suspect would make things a lot easier.
Yeah, that's a good point, because there is commonality between them. We see this on the slide, but we've seen it ourselves as well. You do work in the States and you understand very quickly there's commonalities between those different privacy and protections of data kind of acts and legislations that could be homogenized. So the next point there about ongoing monitoring. I know with ISO 27001, one of the basic core principles is improvement. You should be improving each year. You should be looking at that plan, do, check, act model to try to improve your security implementation on a regular basis and look for augmentations to it. Victoria, did you see anything like this in CCPA, or is there something similar to that concept in CCPA?
Not really. Again, this is an area where I feel CCPA is kind of a little bit of a weak point, is that it, it does say, well, you got to make certain your staff is up to date and everybody understands that they have to be compliant with the law, but it doesn't give you the guidelines. It is one of those areas where, again, I would prefer to go with ISO, IEC, because they tend to be a little bit better in terms of, hey, when was the last time you reviewed your existing policies? How often should personnel be trained? It's again, it's the kind of thing where you're kind of left on your own in terms of risk assessment. Instead, it's kind of saying, well, are you communicating adequately with your users? Are individuals feeling confident that they have a say in your data? But of course, you need, never mind facing lawsuits, if you don't have good security procedures in place, both protecting against external hackers and internal hackers, well, that's going to cause quite a problem. If you have, say, your marketing team is inadequately using data in ways that they're not supposed to be because they have access when they shouldn't, that's quite a problem. So it's certainly, I hope, with the new legislation, I would like to see just a little more guidance in this area.
And Derek, you did see this in the New York Shield Act, that they are looking at some kind of ongoing monitoring.
Yeah, it's similar to ISO. You need to continually review and assess and adapt as the years, days go by. If the information changes that you're collecting, you need to go back and adapt your procedures, protocols, and such to ensure that you're addressing the risk within that.
That makes sense to me. So at the end of the day, when we get to the differences section, obviously ISO IEC 27001 is the best. I can't.
Not biased at all.
So CCPA and New York Shield Act require compliance from the entities to which they apply, whereas ISO isn't mandatory unless you're in an industry where it's made mandatory. So it's more of an international standard you can comply to and meet the measure of the security bar and implement a security program for your organization. CCPA and Shield Act focus on protecting the data and the person, while ISO is more general in its application. So really, for the differences, we also saw for CCPA, obviously, there's some evolution happening already on CCPA, right, Victoria? It's just this week we've seen it evolve.
Very much so. It's arguably part of the differences between privacy and security. You need good security, unquestionably, to have a good privacy program. But with privacy, you're dealing with human beings. You're dealing with individuals, which means part of the struggle is that we all have different definitions of what is personal, what is sensitive to us. We all have different, tolerance of when information can be shared. So that's something these legislations always kind of run up against is, well, how do we make people feel, comfortable in the use of their data, without being overboard, because of course, businesses do need to process a certain amount of data in order to provide services. So we're seeing a lot more, okay, are you being open with users? Are you protecting the information adequately? And can they say no? Again, that gets back to, that right to deletion, that right to opt out. If you're doing something uncomfortable, can users come forward and say, hey, take me out of that. I don't want to be a part of that. I'm not comfortable. Or maybe it compromises me in a way you're not aware.
Right. Yeah, that's a good point, that last one. It may be awareness of the real issue. For an individual, you may have, or for a group of people, you may have special requirements around protecting their data. Derek, what about on the New York Shield Act side? It's focused on protecting, obviously, consumer data or information belonging to individuals, as opposed to organizations protecting data as an organization should.
Yeah, I believe it's, from what I read and understand, it is mainly on protecting the end user. It forces the businesses to take extra time and assess and secure that data, but at the end of the day, it's all about securing for the end user. Is definitely designed for that aspect. The one thing that comes to mind with all of these, if you're a small business, and again, this is my opinion, if you're a small business and you've got a small subset of data, mostly compliance means, but if larger businesses are out there, again, this is just my opinion, with what I see with ISO 27001 and the framework that gives a business, it's a great foundation for all these other ones. So once you can implement information security management system, I think it makes it a lot easier to start complying with these, each individual state privacy acts that are popping up. It just makes, I think, the effort a lot easier to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, and that's a good point, because it does give you that regimen of security in all instances, whether it's information, infrastructure, people, process, physical access, all that stuff will come under that 27001 umbrella, and you get used to applying that on a regular basis. So enacting or enabling the privacy portion shouldn't be that big a lift. That's
my opinion for sure.
So on the first point on the takeaway, Victoria, what's your opinion on that? Can one standard or legislation be used to support compliance with another?
It's a bit of a mix. For starters, I almost want to take the word compliance out of there, even though I know that's what we're always after, because what I find, and this is particularly true with privacy legislations, there's a lot of common ground in a lot of privacy regulations. I kind of hinted before, CCPA and GDPR aren't the same legislation, but at the same time, they both require users to understand what's going on with their information. Both times, users have to be able to have access. Typically, when companies are going international or having different standards in place, I refer them to ISO, and I also refer them to the OECD guidelines for cross-border data transfers, just because a lot of legislations are based on that common framework of, are you communicating? Are you getting consent? Are you giving access? Can people update information? Are you making certain that information isn't being used for biases, for blocking people's paths for certain things? But flip side is, again, privacy is it's a bit cultural. So the idea of one global standard, and this is where, again, ISO kind of wins out a bit more, is because you've had a lot of different people from different backgrounds at the table talking about it. Whereas, California, New York, they're going to look at the local tolerance levels. They're going to look at the local culture and what people are doing to make their decisions.
Right, good point. Derek, on this next one, I think we both went through this mill a few times, maintaining compliance and evidencing it so that you can provide that evidence to external parties, including auditors or customers.
Yeah, this I think goes back to the always, continually improving. If you're always in a state of review, assessing your management system, your compliance with whichever act it might be, you're always going to have the evidence, the ability to spot your deficiencies, if you will, and it's going to make audit time, or in the event there is an incident, it makes it a lot easier to show that you had reasonable controls in place to address it. But that's the nature of the beast with continual compliance or continual improvement.
Right, right. And if you do have an incident, you need to produce that evidence. As you say, it's important that you've already done the legwork and track that evidence. So we're going to be wrapping up here in just a minute and giving some time to questions. Just a few quick points again in these takeaways. You should never rely on one set of security guidance or one standard and just what it contains to build your entire security program and just stay with that. As soon as you do that, of course, you're setting yourself up for a bit of a failure if you don't go beyond what that standard or what that legislation, whatever it is, describes. You should go 2 or 3 steps beyond and look elsewhere for additional information or guidance you can apply as well. It would certainly make your organization more security and privacy resilient. The next one, I know, Victoria, this is one we've talked about a few times. You need a privacy officer.
Yeah. It's one of those things where I find a lot of people, it's like, oh, we don't want that responsibility. It's like, I know, but you need somebody who can basically go through the checklist and say, we've done this, here's our policy, here's when staff was trained. It makes such a difference, even, again, because users have the right to ask what's going on, to have one person say, okay, this is what we're going to tell them.
Yeah, absolutely. And then that person also, sometimes are required by the legislation itself, like GDPR requires a privacy officer to be designated.
It does. Canada as well requires that you're required to have accountability. So you do need to have a privacy officer, somebody at the top who's able to say, yes, we are following the privacy legislations, and here's our evidence of how we're doing so.
Right.
Yeah, much like the NYC Shield Act, you have to have somebody designated to lead this effort as well.
Yeah, and that may be a person that has other roles assigned to them as well. Or it could be, I've seen in many cases, it's external legal counsel who they've secured to be a privacy officer, because that lawyer is a specialist in privacy law. And that can happen. And this last one is an ISO-driven thing, but it's applicable everywhere. Derek mentioned risk assessment, New York Shield Act, and for certain, of course, if you're into something like CCPA where there's no specifics defined, you should do something to try to define your specifics. And a way you can define specifics for an organization is to do an organizational risk assessment, to build your risk register for the organization, and to build out your risk profile, your risk appetite, all those good things you need to help drive you to decide what security and privacy controls you need to and you should put in place. So this is how you can do that for an organization, just an organizational risk assessment, and build your pieces for your risk management program and use that as your guidance. Any comment on that last one, Victoria or Derek?
I will say that last one is, again, with the new privacy legislation in California that's just been approved, that's going to be very important. One of the things we do know about the new California rights is that it increases requirements around sensitive data. It requires much more knowledge of, oh, you have financial information, you have particularly sensitive demographic information. You'll need to be aware of that and protect it adequately. So doing that risk assessment is definitely in the company's best interest.
And so Derek, any closing thoughts on that?
No, I think I covered them off before. The New York Shield Act is definitely heavy in doing the risk assessment and assuring that you've looked at all the potential risks for the data and how you're assessing, processing, and storing it.
Excellent. So that concludes our main presentation, and we can certainly pass it back over to Ardian.
Well, thank you, Victoria, Tony, and Derek for delivering this very detailed and informative session on the topic. Before moving on with the Q&A session, I would like to inform you that PCB offers courses on ISO 27001, which help you show your dedication in implementing and managing privacy-related frameworks, and most importantly, you will be recognized worldwide. Now, I think we have some time to answer 3 or maybe more questions regarding today's topic. So I will start with a more technical one for Victoria and then move on with Tony. So the first one is, does collecting security information about visiting website fall under CCPA? And then for Tony, what industry is 27001 made mandatory?
I'm actually, as we're talking, thinking, I'll have to double check on that one. I'm fairly positive CCPA does. Security information is typically considered an exemption. I know with most privacy laws, there's an exemption for, it's like, oh, you're doing security logs. That's that's a little bit different here. Just going to see if I can find the exact quote for you. Here we go. Let's see. In the meantime, Tony, if you want to.
Sure thing. The industry that I know for certain that 27001 was required in was lottery and gaming. When Derek and I were both in that sector, there were jurisdictions that required 27001, not just compliance, but 27001 certification. And that was often coupled with a second set of compliance requirements from the World Lottery Association that kind of pigeonholed or shimmed onto 27001. So you first had to be 27001 certified, then you get certified to this other lottery-specific standard.
Actually, I just wanted to follow up on there. So yeah, under the exemptions, especially for deletion of information, information that is used to detect security incidents, protect against malicious, deceptive, fraudulent, or illegal activity, or prosecute those responsible for that activity. So there you go. If you are, and certainly a practice I recommend, doing collecting event logging for the security of your website or business, and you're holding on to a certain amount of information in your logs for evidence of fraud, that information is exempted in terms of the information that you have to delete.
Great, thank you. Now, I know you guys were just talking about this a little while ago. Is it mandatory or just common sense to have a privacy officer? Can you delegate a group of people to complete the similar task as a privacy officer?
So in some cases, definitely mandatory. For mine, for 27001, there's no privacy officer designated in that standard because it doesn't really cover that depth. But 27701 does talk to that kind of as somebody in charge of privacy, someone designated. Victoria.
I was going to say, the California Consumer Privacy Act actually doesn't require an officer to be mandated, but as we've hinted before, a lot of other privacy regulations do require that, GDPR being a good one. My personal belief, my personal experience with a group of people is you certainly can have like a board, for example, who's responsible for execution of things, for keeping things in line. As long as there is one person who is going to be accountable for the day-to-day, even if you have a pair of people, again, don't say everybody is responsible for this, because what tends to happen then is that nobody is responsible. So do make certain that there is one or two people who, they realize that's part of our responsibility, is making certain that we are following this. Whether that's a lawyer, or I've seen a lot of CPSOs, so it's a security person who's also got some privacy, that's fine.
Yeah, and the Shield Act is very similar. They just state that you need to designate one or more employees to coordinate the security program. So they don't necessarily say it has to be a data privacy officer, but you need to have somebody, at least one person, that is, the key focus to run the security and privacy program.
Thank you, guys. So another question is, Considering the coverage of each legal diploma presented here, either CCPA or Shield Act, which are focused on the protection of privacy data of local residents, what would be a reasonable way to define a local resident as a New Yorker or a Californian? Would it be enough, a simple self-defined assessment? So maybe Derek can take this one.
I believe it's just if they are a New York State resident, that makes them a person that would fall into that scope. So if you're collecting their name and it's associated with an address, or it can be pulled back to somebody that lives in the state of New York, then they would fall into the requirement of the New York Shield Act.
Okay. Any of one of you guys want to add to that, or?
On GDPR, it's pretty straightforward who they define as a resident. If you're in the EU, you're going to be under that big umbrella. I don't know, CCPA doesn't really define residence data, does it, Victoria?
No, it doesn't. And I suspect that's another one of those areas where if you start to get into the conversation, that's part of the confusion about the CCPA. Fingers across, the new legislation will just maybe beef up a few definitions.
Thank you. Now I think we have time for one or more or two questions and then conclude the session. So the next question is, many nations or regions are implementing privacy regulations, for example, CCPA, GDPR, Brazilian privacy regulation, etc. What advice would you give to a multinational organization that has to do business in more than one of these regions or nations with different privacy regulations or legislations?
Oh, Derek and I have lived that life. Hire people, whether you hire consultants or full-time staff, hire people who can research those for you, and make sure at least one of your entities you're using for that advice is a lawyer of some sort who can collect the details of each law in each jurisdiction and interpret them properly. I think Victoria's thinking in the same way.
Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and say that's called do a data protection impact assessment or a privacy impact assessment. That includes legislative analysis, so that'll break down the laws and the specifics of what you need to comply with. I also hinted earlier, again, it's not ISO, but I recommend the OECD, which is the Organization of Economic OECD, Guidelines for Protection of Personal Information, just because it's funny, a lot of these different privacy laws, and I say this as somebody who's read New Zealand's law, Australia's law, Canada's law, GDPR, they actually often have very common frameworks, very common areas in terms of data quality, in terms of access to information, in terms of not necessarily technical requirements for safeguards, but making certain those safeguards do exist. So if you can comply, again, for the GDPR, that usually means that you are in compliance already with a significant portion of other privacy laws. You just need to, again, have that legislative analysis to say, okay, is there something specific for contracts that we need? Are there limits on disclosure? Are there, again, is there something our privacy notice needs? But the basic, again, that foundations of we know what we're collecting, we're very clear about what we're using for the purpose, users can access it. A lot of that tends to be very common across international laws, which as a privacy person, I gotta tell you, I'm very grateful for. It certainly makes life a lot easier.
Thank you, guys. So now to conclude this session, we have one final question. Do you think that there has been any initiative to come up with a unique or general law for US for privacy in general, and not have separate laws for each state?
In my experience,
I haven't heard or seen anything yet. Oh, sorry, Tony. Go ahead.
No, I agree, Derek. You're right. The one thing I did see, and this is just something that I'm trained in, so I don't want to market a product or anything, but I'm trained and certified in high trust, which is kind of an amalgam of security and privacy laws and regulations and standards, all from across the US, including HIPAA, state laws in Texas and Massachusetts and California. And it also includes ISO 27001, PCI DSS, SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 controls, and SOX compliance elements as well, all under one big roof. But that's really a private initiative by a private company out of Texas that built this thing. And it's for auditing organizations against this giant set of controls. That is an amalgam of a whole bunch of those controls and standards and acts from across the US and elsewhere. But that's the only thing I've ever seen done.
There have been talks at the national level of the US of having a national privacy law. The problem is it hasn't gone anywhere. If you do some research on this, what you find is that it's the kind of thing where, especially, GDPR being a good example, when GDPR was in force, the US, there was a lot of conversation, should we have this legislation? And it just kind of tends to fizzle out. They always tend to get it kind of pushed back for other, more urgent requirements. One of the things I would be very curious about, of course, is even if a national law came to the table, you have to think about who the different interest groups who are going to be at that table. You're going to have certainly a lot of lawyers. You're going to have a lot of human rights individuals. You're going to have a lot of Silicon Valley giants, technology companies who will have a stake in the game. So it's to get a legislation passed, it will be, like I say, I would love to see it, certainly make things a lot easier, but it would require a significant amount of effort because there's a significant amount of voices who will have concerns or who will want things in a certain way.
And the nature of the beast in the United States is federal interference in state affairs is often frowned upon. So it's a big uphill battle. Their implementation of HIPAA was great, fantastic, good step forward in protecting health data. But to take it another level to PII, that's a big job, as Victoria alluded to.
It will also be California's law, again, that's a private sector legislation. So even if we do see privacy laws, another part of the question will be, is this for private sector? Is it going to be for federal agencies? I very highly doubt we will see anything at the federal level that dictates what states can do with personal information, because again, I can see the appetite not being there. I can see a lot of resistance for that.
Well, thank you once again, Tony, Victoria, and Derek, for this outstanding session. And I would like also to thank everyone who attended today's session. Before concluding the session, I would like to inform you that in our newest training course delivery format, e-learning, besides the Foundation and Lead Implementer course, the ISO 27001 Lead Auditor course is now available as well. For more information about our webinars or our training courses, please visit our website, www.pecb.com. Also, this session will be recorded and posted on our website, as well as on our YouTube channel, along with the slides of the presentation. Thank you all once again, and stay safe.